Lew, I'd like to thank you for your willingness to do this as the director of, if Toronto reunion had actually taken place, I would have been the director of that reunion. And I was part of the team that has been organizing these various activities throughout July and August. And Lew was very gracious to accept my invitation to him to do this series. I wasn't actually able to participate in it myself previously, but I heard amazing things about it. So I'm excited to be here tonight. And Lew, just thank you so much for your willingness to do this for us, to teach us some new things and to help us get through this strange new world and give us, a sense of being with our camp community during, a time when we actually physically can't be with our camp community. I know it means a great deal to all of us to see each other. And for those of you who are here with us tonight, spread the word. Please make sure you tell people about all the activities you're participating in. And also feel free to check out, if you're used to just the Camp Toronto program, check out what's going on with the other camps as well, because they have all put a lot of effort into setting up various activities. And, as sad as we are not to be able to gather in person, it's a great opportunity to see the various types of programming that the other reunions and camps do throughout the summer. So Lew, thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's a great segue into talking about what we hope to accomplish here in doing this session. So, in fact, many of you were at the session that we had last time, and many of you were also participating in some of the other lecture series that we had earlier this year, in particular the ones that Tony Chavala-Smith did and the ones that Zach Mack did, the Zach Harmon McLaughlin, or Zach Mack as he's known. And so when we begin to think about what do we do to follow up on that? One of the things that someone expressed to me, and I thank you for many of you who replied to my email, one of the comments was, in Zach's presentations in particular, the chat window was very active. Now, he had like 100 people or something, and so there was a lot of chat activity going on. And someone said, I just want to do the chat stuff. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping to aim for, is that we can work together, but then actually chat. And if there are few enough of us, not that I necessarily want it to be few in number, but we're going to try and keep the mics open so that as we're going along, we can ask questions and begin to have that conversation. So, Joy, Zoom has changed. It used to be that the host could actually mute and unmute people, and now you can mute people, but you have to unmute yourself. So I encourage you at any time in the stuff that I'm presenting or as we're talking, that if you got something to say, that you unmute, put up your hand, and make sure that you get a chance to talk. All agreed? Good. So I am going to share my screen, and I'll put up a few slides, and we'll start from there. So let's. Oh, and the other qualification I have to give is that I have an extremely intermittent problem with my laptop that just all of a sudden showed up. And it seems to be in abeyance right now, but if all of a sudden everything goes weird, we'll have to go to plan B. And is my screen showing now?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So we described the title for this presentation as what now? As we begin to think about, a few things have changed. we ask ourselves, well, what's new since we last talked about this? And as you'll recall, if you were part of the session that we did last fall, where we started in September, and I think we did 5 weeks leading up to being with President Veazey at the Mission Conference, and we called that Restoration Adventures 3.0. And we were trying to explore some of the changes that were taking place in the church. And we thought we were being really prescient and peering into the future. We didn't do so good. In that, if we think about what the world was like back in September, and compared to where we are now, not even a year later, there are so many things that are different. And that's part of what we want to explore a little bit here tonight, is to talk about it. In particular, I want to ask the question, what have we learned since September 2019? So I'm going to do a little bit of a review, particularly for people who weren't involved back in September, just so we maybe have some common vocabulary and so on. But once that's done, I want to open up and talk about this business of what's different and what have we learned in the last little while. Then in the subsequent sessions, we can take some of that and begin to explore it a little bit more. So hopefully you're all nodding your heads that that's okay, and I will just keep on going for a moment. You'll remember that I started out the sessions last time talking in the words of 3 different commentators or sources, one of which was Barbara Brown Taylor. The second one was a Canadian, Douglas John Hall, who is in fact a professor of theology, emeritus professor at McGill, and was for many, many years the minister and theologian at the United Church of Canada. And we also looked at some of the source material that comes from our own tradition, from Grant and from Steve. And we begin to ask ourselves, what does it mean when we look back at what Grant was talking about all those many years ago now, 24 years ago, when he said, we need to talk about moving our identity from being a people with a prophet to our calling as a prophetic people. So that's part of what we want to talk about. Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book, says no one longs for what he or she already has. But the reason so many of us cannot see the red X that marks the spot is because we are standing on it. We always have this sense that we're missing something, that if we just had whatever, that life would be good. Think about the times not only in our personal lives, but in our lives as a church, as a congregation. How many times have we said to ourselves, if we just did such and so, that would make things so much better? And yet Barbara Brown Taylor pointing out that sometimes we can't see because what we lack is the willingness to imagine that we already have everything that we need. And I wonder if that applies to our church as well. And so we explored a little bit and we asked, if we see here in Doctrine and Covenants where it says God is calling for prophetic community, and then says, this faith community has been given abundant gifts, resources, and opportunities for it to become the community that God's looking for. And we ask ourselves, are we lacking the imagination that we already have? And do we in fact have everything that we need? Barbara Brown Taylor went on to say, the only thing missing is our consent to be where we are. And that's where we ask the question, and so where are we as a faith community? Where are we as a church? And again, we go back to hear the prophetic voice that talks about our continuing faith adventure with God, and divinely led that's eventful and challenging and sometimes surprising to you. And certainly today, the sometimes surprising is one that we've experienced, that we're in the midst of experiencing. That scripture goes on to say that we as a people, we as a church are poised to fulfill God's ultimate vision for the church. And we ask it, is our consent to fulfill that vision the only thing that is missing? Douglas John Hall wrote a book called Waiting for Gospel. And it's important to note that it was not waiting for the gospel, not waiting for some official set of doctrines or dogmas or anything that has institutional weight. But the title is Waiting for Gospel. Of course, the word gospel comes to us in English from the Greek that means good news. Waiting for the good news. And Hall goes on to say that the gospel's not a just write it down and you've got it here, good, forever. That it belongs to the church. But in fact, he asserts that the exact opposite is true. It's not the church dog that wags the gospel tail. The gospel is the dog, and the church is the tail. Have we heard this in our own words, in our own tradition? I suggest that we have. We've heard this message. The spirit of the restoration is not locked in one moment of time. It is a call to every generation. Douglas John Hall described it as the gospel becomes the church as the church discovers over and over and over again. It says that only through the often painful rediscovery of gospel is the community made capable of proclaiming good news in its worldly context. So I want you to think about, when we get to talking about what's different, think about what he means here by being made capable of proclaiming good news. We have been called over and over again to discern the divine will for our own time in the places that we serve. We've been challenged over and over again to rediscover the restoration anew. New forms of ministry, new forms of operating. And the question now is, what do we do with these scriptures? How do we then go forward? And I'm not going to depress everybody by bringing out all the statistics that we went through last time that shows how the churches have gone through all these challenges. We do know that our churches are aging, that our churches are dwindling, that money is getting scarcer, and so on and so on. We also know that that is not unique to our tradition. That in fact, there's something going on here that is being shared by all Christian traditions, at least in the Western world. We still have this sense that, oh, we just need to do something about this. And in particular, we really, really, really want to believe that there's some magic spot. That if we just had the right whatever, that it would fix all of the things that we face. And there's all kinds of them, and you've heard them. Maybe you've said some of them. But as we went through and looked at some of the literature and what was some of the commentators, we began to see that it probably isn't something that can be solved with some magic bullet. But in fact, there are changes that are happening in the world around us and that we can't stop them. John Darhauer, in his book, titles it Beyond Resistance. These changes are coming at us. They're beyond our capacity to resist, like these massive waves that are simply taking us with them. We then went on to look at some ways that we can put some labels on things. And again, just as a quick reminder, we came and began to talk about this idea of postmodernism. And I'm going to zip through these real fast. The problem with postmodernism is that if you're like me and want to have, real definitions that say it's this and that, you're not going to find that here. This idea of this postmodernism is kind of vague and fuzzy, and it's very controversial in some places. Some people claim it started decades and decades ago, and others say it's hardly a thing and it hasn't even happened. So here's kind of a really rough view of what it might look like. We think about the pre-modern era, and again, we're using modern not in the everyday sense of modern, meaning what happens in 2020, but using modern in the academic sense of that was a particular age that we went through. In the pre-modern era, which in general is sort of before the printing press, if you will, we know that there were some things that we could take for granted. There was only one church. Again, in the context of Western civilization, there was one church. It didn't even have a name. Today, we would refer to it as the Roman Catholic Church, but back then, there was only one church, so it was just the church. And it was pretty clear that the church interpreted all things having to do with salvation. And so you listen to the church and the church fathers, and in fact, the church was an important political entity because it was the only voice that stood up against king and empire. We get to the age of the printing press, and suddenly you have a lot more voices, the ability to have information being shared through books. And the idea that we go through these different ages, the age of reason and the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, scientific discoveries and so on, all of these things are happening over a period of the next 500 years. And perhaps one way to describe this was the sky's the limit. Humans are awesome. Lots of people basically said, we don't need God. We're going to discover everything that we ever need to know. using the scientific method and all of this other good stuff. Most trace that line of thinking, that idea that if we just reason things out, if we just explore it scientifically, if we just study it enough, we'll learn everything there is to be known, and we'll keep improving our world. Every new discovery can make things better, and we will continue to evolve as civilization and as a species. And what happened? Well, along comes World War I. And then right after that comes the Great Depression. And then World War II. And suddenly this idea, suddenly in a historical sense, over a period of a few decades, this idea that humans were going to continue to become this great, smarter, ever better civilization was suddenly really, really set back. And this idea that, like, oh, wait a minute, humans are kind of evil. We need a different way to think about this. And this is kind of the beginning of the postmodern era. Now, again, all kinds of scholars argue about it and so on. But in this very, very quick overview, we're going to say that it probably was in the post-war era. You suddenly went from a time when you had all these returning vets that were just happy to be there. They worked hard. We didn't really call the problems PTSD back then. And it was off to go and do all these things. And when the issues of what happened during the war it became questions, it was answered by television saying, oh, just buy this stuff, do more, do all of that. And this age of consumerism also came to the church and to some of the philosophers. And so we get this idea that God is dead. Protests, protests, protests. Disillusion with consumers, with what was going on, with the war, with government, with capitalism, with patriarchy, basically disillusion with everything that was happening that mom and dad liked. Those became issues in the 60s and the 70s. In the 90s and the 2000s, particularly with the rise of the internet and cable television, we get this shrinking world. Suddenly the problems around the world come right to our living room. And what we're left with is nowhere to hide. The ugliness of humanity is on full display. The challenges of the institutions of the modern era were on full display. And everywhere we looked, we saw some kinds of abuse, misconduct. And fear is sold everywhere. So out of that, then comes not when a switch turns on, but as our world changed over that whole time period, we begin to have what now being identified as a postmodern way of thinking, postmodern mindset. This is not about millennials. This is not about Gen X or any of the other kind of stuff. There are many of us of a certain age and a certain grayness of hair who still have postmodern mindset, who have come to understand and to see the world through that particular lens. Not 100%, but some of those things may be there. And so out of that, we identify three primary mindsets. The number 3 one is that we don't trust institutional authority. Just because so-and-so said it, we don't necessarily trust it. We see that, for instance, in the news as entertainment business. Some of you may remember your parents or grandparents who, if something was printed in the newspaper, it was right up there beside the Bible. Not so much anymore. The second mindset is one about how we learn, much more experiential, as opposed to we learn from authority or authoritative sources. And the big one is that there are no universal truths. Essentially saying what is true for you may or may not be true for me. And so this postmodern world comes with a whole different view of seeing the world. And that has then big implications. So again, just a few more slides that I want to cover here to talk about this idea of truth. Because this is the biggie, I think, for us as we begin to talk about what's changed and what we can learn and where we go next, is understanding this concept of truth in our world today. The postmoderns would say that there are no universal truths. And in fact, no pun intended, facts are socially constructed. Now, we're not quite going to the concept of alternative facts in the way that certain government people would describe them, but rather this idea that facts are understood and are created by people who have a particular, what the scientists and the scholars would call a social position. In other words, they're saying, we look through the world through our lens. And so we then perceive, interpret, understand, and judge the world and talk about it in a particular way because of who we are. And then we turn around and we use symbols and words and images that are not neutral. We know that words, using one word versus another, to communicate something, to have a huge impact on how it's understood and perceived by other people who are in their own social positions. So in other words, they're kind of saying this is like that telephone game that we used to play as kids where you whisper something to the person next to you. And by the time it gets to somebody else, they're hearing a context and a message that is not the same necessarily as the one that started out. And so it's using that understanding where today they would say that truth is not found, but made. And if truth is then made, then making truth means that we're exercising power. Okay, so I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with or buy into all of that. That's the expression of that mindset that we have. And the example that I used was the baseball umpires, and it basically says we have a pre-modern umpire. They just say there's some absolute truths out there, and they're balls and they're strikes, and I just call them the way they are. That there's no interpretation. The modern umpire, the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, says, well, I understand that I may have a different angle and may be looking through here or through there, but there's still this idea that there's this truth about what's a ball and what's a strike, and I call it as I see it. The postmodern umpire basically says they aren't anything until I call them, until I interpret what they are. That's a postmodern mindset. There's a bunch of really positive things that come out of postmodernism. And we looked at a whole bunch of the value of relationships and community, celebrating diversity, being open-minded in the sense that everyone needs to find their own path, that values tolerance, that everyone's story is valid, has a less romantic or less heroic view of history, open to many other areas of, of the world. It also is valuable because it refutes the modernist claim that science and reason are the only paths to understanding the world in truth. So it's an acceptance that there is mystery, that there are things that are not knowable in a laboratory that we need to be caring about. But there's also some weaknesses that come with this whole idea of postmodernism. One of the big challenges is denying the existence of truth when truth is real. And that's basically saying that science does have some things right and that we need to pay attention to them. In our modern culture, postmodern thinking often retreats to modern thinking, modernist thinking, when it suits them, when it's in their best interest. And so you will hear people who are quite willing to say, well, that science doesn't matter, turning around and saying, but, you got to look at this. There's also the challenge of circular reasoning that says, if there is no certainty, are you absolutely sure there isn't? And people are saying, well, I'm certain there's no certainty. And so it gets a little bit in that kind of circular reasoning as you begin to think through some of these discussions and these arguments. And these aren't, we got to remember that these ideas filter into every part of our life. And so when we begin to then look at for instance, reducing the importance of individuals and individual dignity because everybody's is valid, then we begin to see how this all starts to seep into all kinds of things in our lives. Modernity is kind of this world, the context that we're growing up in, and postmodernism is conceptual. It's like trying to nail some jello to the wall. It's hard to define, and yet it's clearly there. It's not good or bad, it just is. And it can be used for positive things or for negative things. And definitely, we know that everyone is not a fan. And so this postmodern type of thinking is butting up against all kinds of things in our world today. Government, business, religion, education, justice. You can go online and find all kinds of people who are arguing about it, particularly in things like education and in religion, that are arguing about how we should think about the world. So, if you think you got a good handle on modernity, the 500 years that we lived through up until the beginning, for many of us, sort of butts up against our lifetime, and as we're beginning to go through this transition into postmodernism, you should also be aware that there really is a thing now called postmodernism. And it's beginning to kind of poke its head up because there's an understanding that postmodernism, if you take that idea that there's no ultimate truths, can begin to lead you down this path where there are no truths at all. And yet we kind of know that that isn't really how the world is. And that's not how our society functions and how civilization kind of works. Because if everything's right, if everybody's right, then how could anything be wrong? And yet clearly there are some things that are wrong and some things that need to be dealt with. And so postmodernism, post-postmodernism is about how do we take that messiness of all of the weaknesses of postmodernism and make it a little less messy. And most of this movement seems to be going back to say, well, wait a minute, this bit about rational stuff and some real scientific truths and so on that we accepted in modernism, some of that's kind of useful and some of that is really good, and it doesn't work very well if we get rid of that. And if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about some of this, a very recent Project Zion podcast talks about these ideas. Essentially, what postmodernism is saying is, don't throw the baby out when you're doing this. Even though there are some real problems with the modern thinking and how our world has turned out, there's also some value there. And so perhaps the other metaphor you might use is that the pendulum is swinging back a little bit towards the middle as we think about postmodernism and saying, how do we value things that come from that modern tradition, as well as the valuable things that are coming from postmodern thinking. So I'd like to pause there for a little bit and see if there's any questions or observations that anybody would like to make about, since we talked about this last time, have you seen these ideas, have you seen these concepts of postmodernism show up in your life and in the church since you began to think about them? Anybody got any examples? Go ahead, Susan.
Well, I'm thinking about how some people say the COVID is a hoax. It's not real. And I'm looking at the science that I've been told and the evidence of people being ill. So I think yes, therefore it looks to be true, but there's many people between that and we won't go into the vaccine issue, but for COVID, I struggled why people thought it was not real, but I guess maybe that's that there's no truths. Is that where you would see that?
It could be. Certainly there's there are different kinds of decision making that could take one to that kind of an opinion, but yeah, this idea that that Dr. Fauci's opinion is just an opinion, and so your brother-in-law's second cousin's opinion is equally valid, is also a challenge sometimes. But yeah, that's a good example. Any others?
I was watching a video on YouTube last night on John Wayne. And it was an hour and a half long. It was quite long. And the video was made 15, 20 years ago. And John Wayne is undoubtedly a hero. And he undoubtedly, in this video, right, is a great man. Such a great man that they named a airport after him, John Wayne International Airport in California. And now John Wayne is being vilified because times have changed. And he had one interview with, I can't even remember who, this wasn't in the video. This is just a recent criticism of John Wayne. But John Wayne was a racist, because John Wayne basically said in the interview that blacks that should not get the vote because they are not ready for the vote. When they're ready for the vote, when they've matured and they can make good decisions, then they can vote. So the black movement in the United States is vilifying, and they're taking one little quote and then making that the context. And it could be that if you ask John Wayne separately to refine his statement, he might say that I don't think that anyone should vote until they reach a certain level of maturity and understanding so that they can make a rational vote, right? So John Wayne was a product of the 1950s and 60s when the United States needed a specific type of hero to reinforce their views during the Second World War and the communist period of aggression. So there's modification and things change over time, and the context changes over time, and then a person is vilified over time, right? So when you talk about truth, right, and when you measure a man's life, you measure the man's life at the end of his life or the beginning of his life, right? Some people are made heroes and they shouldn't have been, and other people should not necessarily be de-heroinized, right? I'm not sure of but in this change over time, but you can take the same situation now, apply it to the church. The church institutions have done, all the church institutions, not talking about reorganized church or the Catholic Church or whatever, but churches over a period of time try to function inside what's happening in the culture at that time, right? And if you look back at them, you can say there was all kinds of things wrong, but as they move through the path of growth, they change. But you can't vilify the person. You can't vilify our church necessarily for something that happened in 1837, you know?
Yeah, that's a good example. You can find lots of other examples in the news this week about that same business of saying, wait a minute, that truth that statue represents, that truth that monument represents, that truth that our understanding about that history represents is now not valid because of something else that person said.
Like John, I apologize for using John Wayne, but John Wayne could say today, he could say, if he was still alive at 92 or something, you're absolutely right. What I was like in 1950s is totally unacceptable today, but I've changed and I've modified. Does that make it unacceptable? Right.
And so, you know, we're seeing that come up in all kinds of places in our world. You know, you name a school after someone, and then you find out later that they did such and such and so and so. I'm watching with great interest the people talking to J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books. If you haven't followed it, it turns out that she's got some pretty strong opinions, negative mostly, about transgender people. But what's interesting is that the postmodern mindset doesn't say, gee, that's too bad that she feels that way, but boy, those books were sure good. Now people are saying, oh my gosh, I won't ever be able to enjoy or to read Harry Potter books anymore because of the comments that she's making. And so that idea that all these truths are all wound together is part of that idea of postmodern thinking. This idea, if you're on social media, you'll see this, people talking about cancel culture, where, for instance, there are some very well-known academics. There's one at the University of Toronto, Peterson. There's a Canadian at Harvard, Steven Pinker, who a certain segment of the population is saying, we can't accept anything that they've ever written, because if we take these statements, sometimes if you read them, they're just a tiny bit out of context, those statements don't completely fit our value system. And the words "our value system" mean the value system that we have now constructed in the last 10 or 15 years, not the society's value statement over the last 45 years, which is perhaps when the person made the statement. So on one side, you have people saying, well, that's the only way that we get rid of these old white guys that have these entrenched ideas, is by getting them out of there. And other people are saying, well, wait a minute. These are some people that have had lots of useful things to say. We may argue with their statements, but we don't throw that baby out with this other bathwater. So that's a really good example of kind of a phenomenon that we're seeing that I think does reflect that whole idea of postmodern thinking. Yeah. Can you think of any examples in the church?
Yeah, I do. I was working on a disciples' generous response. And the more I worked on it, the more frustrated I got, because I was looking at the outcomes of generosity and trying to bring reason and sanity to the argument. And in the middle of that process, I realized that generosity does not make sense. Generosity is something that happens in the lives of people, and the outcomes are because that happens. And so I had to change what I was thinking and what I was going to say. I still had the same outcomes that I wanted when people were had generosity, but I had to recognize that there was a process in their life of generosity that created the outcomes. And no amount of reason that I could think of would convince people to be generous. But when people become engaged in community and saw need and felt need and recognized that they themselves had a call to be part of that community, then all of those outcomes that I was wanting for, wishing for, would be a reality. So within the church, I think sometimes we try and, the easiest part is to try and make an argument to say, here's the reason why we should do something. And rather than saying, you know what, the Spirit is working in people's lives, we need to prepare pathways that they can express themselves, rather than say, put money in the offering. Money will come in the offering when they recognize that they are part of the need and part of the justice of humanity that we're called to support. So
I think that's an excellent example. Kathy?
I have something really similar, Dar. This week I read something, and I wrote it down in my journal here. Diversity isn't a goal, it's an outcome, right? You can say, okay, we want to be really diverse. We're going to put this together, we're going to have all these different colors, we're going to have different things. But that's not what it's about. That's a photo op. We don't want a photo op. We want real diversity. It's an outcome of what we do. So it's the same sort of thing.
Okay, good example. Pat?
I just wonder, though, with history and with throwing the baby out with the bathwater, how do we ever learn? Like, I mean, I've changed from teenage to adulthood, and my thoughts, a lot of things have changed, but that doesn't mean I throw my history away because I was young and stupid and did dumb things. I can't just say, I'll never think of that again. I'm going to pretend that never happened, as much as I wish it didn't, but it did. And it's part of my, and I think the church is the same. We have our history. Joseph Smith was an odd duck, but he did some weird things, but because of him, we're here today. And it's not like we still follow everything that he says, but we've learned from that and we've evolved from it. And we need to appreciate that that's what happened then. And we're not going to go back there and do that. But now this is happening now. I just think that there's our truths change, and it doesn't mean they're good or bad or you throw them away. And taking down a statue doesn't change history. It is history. It happened, you know, and we'll learn from it, hopefully, and not, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you just expressed right there that tension between a modern view of saying, hey, we're not throwing out our history, you know, we need to learn some things from that. But at the same time, you're saying, but I'm who I am because of all of those things that happened to me. You know, I'm not like the person next to you or whatever, you know, so that's a very postmodern kind of view of saying my understanding of the world is unique because I went through all of those things. And so, yeah, I think you expressed very well that kind of tension that we live in between modernism and postmodernism. Was it Claire?
I was just going to carry on for part of that, but one of my favorite programs when I used to watch TV was the CSI, a criminal investigation scene, where they will determine that a fact is a fact. A fingerprint is a fingerprint, and you can't change it. Well, when we were growing up 50 or 60 years ago, we learned some things about the church which were facts. Well, those facts obviously have changed, and they are no longer truth. And we have to move past that with new knowledge and new insight, they become new facts, and we have to accept those. And again, you don't throw everything out because of something happened to somebody in the past.
Okay, David?
One thing I've observed in the church is that, you know, there's a demographic in the church that puts a lot of stock on revelation and craves revelation, thirsts for revelation, but a large percentage of that demographic will often decide that when the revelation comes, they don't like it.
Gary?
So sometimes this diversity and the change factors that we experience, they happen to us because they hit us in the face. You know, we're not really looking for them. It's sort of that intersection of our life with the other and with new knowledge and relationships and so forth. But there is a way that we can intentionally become more acquainted with different viewpoints, and Encounter, for example, is one of those means that by attending something where we learn about diversity and differences and other truths and practices, it challenges who we are, and we move along a path of transition to reevaluate and be more accepting of others. And you know, that diversity is something then that we experience.
Right, and that's one of the most positive aspects of postmodernism. So Carrie just expressed a very postmodern viewpoint, you know, of saying that there's value in understanding, there's value in interpreting those things. That doesn't say that every time he goes from Encounter class that he converts religions. And yet the understanding and celebrating and accepting is very much a postmodern value. Okay, and so certainly, as we talked about last time, we as a church have gone through very much kind of a modernist to a postmodernist perspective shift. Okay, and in fact, I think that's a couple of the next slides if we want to review that and kind of remind ourselves where we as a church have come from. Getting back to some of the things that Uncle Claire said was, we as a church went through that process of saying, well, wait a minute, some of the things that we have uncritically accepted as being truth as the historians, as people begin to dig into it, we had to come to an understanding that truth didn't necessarily reflect the reality, and so we changed. So why don't I, unless anybody's got any other Anne?
I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's been kind of an aha moment that I've thought of our seekers, the LDS seekers that have come into the church, and how we've been in a state of being ready to accept them. And they are ready to be accepted and loved into the church. Somehow that acceptance, maybe 10 years ago, couldn't have happened. But with some of the postmodern thinking that we have, we're opening ourselves more and being more receptive to the changes and the things that we have in common. So
that's a great observation. And I think that if you're looking for a really something that really crystallizes the difference between a modernist view of the world and a postmodern view of the world, is to actually look at or talk to someone who, as a seeker, has gone through that transition from our LDS cousins who live in a very black and white world. It's extremely binary, black or white, true or false. That's a very, very modern point of view. And in fact, one of the biggest challenges in talking and listening to seekers, that they will tell you that one of the biggest challenges they have is going from a world of certainty, i.e. a modern way of looking at the world, and coming into our community, and they're constantly asking, well, what do you think about this? Or what do you believe about this? Or what about this? Or what about that? And what do we tend to do? We shrug. It's like, I don't know. Some things we just don't think about. We don't spend a lot of time in our tradition, for instance, talking about the afterlife. We just got to shrug. It's like, I don't know, whatever. And so there's this kind of sense of great uncertainty that is very disconcerting for them. Now, after a while, they begin to see the value that offers, and that people can develop their own discipleship, can be on a different part of the journey. They're not censured for feeling that it might be this way rather than this way. But that's a great example of going from a more modern mindset to much more of Community of Christ postmodern mindset. So how are we doing? I got a couple of minutes, and I just want to finish on a couple of these things where we can just remind ourselves of where we came from. And hopefully you can see that slide again.
Yes.
Okay, so just want to remind us, and we use as shorthand, we talk about going from RLDS, which kind of represents our modern selves, to Community of Christ, which represents a little more of our postmodern selves. And so we held up this idea that just as people have gone through this mind shift, just as we, having lived over the last few decades, have perhaps gone through these shifts in our thinking, as some of the people described in our conversation, the church itself has gone through this mind shift, and we have come with it based on the fact that we're still here. And so we have gone from a doctrine focus, again, the idea of doctrine, of a fixed set of beliefs, is a very modern concept. And so we've gone from that to one based on the enduring principles, which is a very postmodern kind of concept. And so out of that have come our understanding or our valuing of more diversity, more inclusion, less doctrine, more principles, ecumenism, promoting community rather than promoting institution, to focus on peace, care for the creation, and social justice. And you'll remember that we kind of said, hey, does that sound familiar? Because in fact, those were the same values that we saw being upheld by the postmoderns. Okay, so as we come to the end of tonight, I hope now we're kind of at a place where we can say, gee, we've already made all these changes. We're already coming to a place, and there's some great expressions of how we've changed. Next time I want to bring in, what have we learned in the last year? What have we learned as we've gone through this pandemic? What have we learned as we've begun to experience church in a different way? And begin to then meld that into that question of, so, not only was it a question of, gee, what are we going to do as a church to fill all those empty pews? And now going to say, well, wait a minute, when are we even going to get to fill those pews again? And to ask ourselves, does it matter? Have we learned some things as we've gone through this process about what church might look like for us in the future? So that's what I hope to cover next week. We open it up if there's any last comments or questions, and otherwise we'll see you next week. Susan.
So when you were talking about postmodernism, do you see Community of Christ on that path? And is that where you're thinking we're going? Is that what we're going to talk about next time?
Sure, we can. Let's open it up. What do other people think?
Well, I just didn't know what you said. We're keeping some of the great things about modernism and postmodernism. So I'm just trying to think. So what are we going to keep? What are we going to? How will it look?
Yeah, we do want to explore that.
Okay.
Good there.
I was taking that course with Zach. One of the things that he said was talking about mission. And, he's talking about the church as well. And he gave an illustration that the church is just a building. However, there are some churches who have tried to make their church, their physical building, a mission statement. So instead of having a great big wall like we have in our gymnasium, I'm suggesting that we paint a beautiful picture on there of peace and justice and maybe a baptismal scene. I don't know, a number of things that, so every time somebody goes in that building, it gives them a message. And we got 3 big walls on the gymnasium and 2 walls on the outside. We could send a really good message to all our neighbors, if nothing else. And
okay. You keep that, because we're going to talk specifically about that. Because that's one of the things that we want to talk about, is this whole idea of mission. So that's definitely a topic for one of the sessions. That's a great example. Susan?
And can you also, I talked with Katie Harmon McLaughlin about a lecture on practicing the prophetic in decision making. We were talking about all the discernment process, and I know there's a lot on our website, but specifically for some of our churches are needing to make some decisions to be in the building, to where our mission is. And will there be any online Zoom lectures on how to discern that?
Or no, maybe we'll get there. Maybe we'll go there.
I would like to talk about how we identify where we're going. What is our plan? And what are the conditions that change? And the reason why I bring it up is I listened to a documentary on Mike Tyson, and he was asked, you know, when you go into a fight, you have a plan. He goes, I always have a plan when I go into a fight till I get punched in the face. and then I have to change my plan, because if I get up with the same plan, I'm in trouble. So we as a church, how do we go through that reconciliation and dialogue process to say, you know what, the plan of the 50s doesn't work for the 80s, the one for the 80s doesn't work for the 90s. We're in, 2020 as leadership in congregations and small groups and so forth. How do we make those plans so we have some consistency to what we're doing and yet have the agility to adjust and to adapt to the changing things that are happening so quickly? So that's the discussion I'd like to have.
Yeah. So again, I just want us to hear, what Dar's expressing is some of the tension between our desire to think modern. We got to have plans. We got to do some things. We got to, our institution is effectively an expression of modernism. Not that that's bad, but we now have to say, as we're doing these things, and we need to do them, we begin to see how the concepts of postmodernism are kind of bumping up against our institution and our history of how we perceive those. So yeah, that's a great example, and I definitely want to spend some time in one of the sessions down the road of saying, how do we at the congregational level, how do we do that process that Dar just mentioned of what do we do with budget? What do we do with this? What do we do with that? And how do we make it make sense in terms of our current reality? So yeah, those are all good questions that I hope we do get to. Kathy.
There we go. I'm unmuted now. I was thinking about a quote that we had today, and in it had places where you serve. And that's muddy now. Places where you serve. Because it used to be that our places that we served and that we had influence were places in our community and at our congregation, and it was a building. And now, if we get onto Zoom meetings, we're meeting with people all over the world. So I can serve somebody in Germany. I can serve somebody in California. So the places where we serve has really taken a direction somehow or other.
Yeah, that's a great example, and that's what I'm going to try and hopefully get to in the next session. That we're going to talk about what is the reality of the pandemic. What are we learning about that? And that's a good example of you're saying, hey, we're seeing things differently now. It was fascinating on Sunday in the Beyond the Walls service, as the background is that, of course, the people that are sharing kind of meet on Zoom, and then it's shared with everyone else. And I believe it was Nancy Ross was half joking, said to John Hamer, so have you become a mega church now? And we all laughed. and yet, when I thought about that for a little bit, it's kind of like, gee, certainly in the context of Community of Christ, having all of those people with all of that giftedness and everything else that is in there, there's probably have been very few other congregations that would be anywhere near that size other than the ones that you would find at a world conference. What does that tell us? And what do we learn about that? Kathy?
Just directly on that, Lou, I was thinking the other day about our CEM conference and thinking that I haven't talked to John Hamer about this, but I'm wondering the membership, the actual membership of Toronto. We could have people all over the world as members of CEM, that we have to consider that it is their right to vote at our conference. Now, maybe somebody here can comment on that, but I'm thinking if they're members of Toronto, they're voting members.
So again, I'm going to ask you to just make sure you remember that, because that's one of the questions that I want us to answer, you know, as we begin to think about, gee, where does this take us? Because one of the big things we have to come to grips with is, what are the measures of being a good church? What are the measures of being an effective church? What are the measures of being a missional church? And some of those points that you're raising absolutely come to the fore. And yeah, those are, at one level you say those are great problems to have to grapple with those. And yet clearly that harbingers a very different world from the one that we've always known in our congregational life. Thanks be to God. You know, it's that kind of tension between, oh gosh, we got another set of problems, and thank goodness we got these challenges because we're going places. Okay, so again, thank you so much. I hope that you found something of value here, and I'll look forward to next Tuesday. We'll take the next step, and if you want to, by all means, send me an email or get in touch with me somehow if you've got other ideas or things that you want us to try and cover, and we'll try and sneak them in here. This has been fun. I hope you had fun too.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Lew.
All right.
Thank you.